After 6 years of divorce, my ex-wife suddenly says she regrets it. She regrets the affair she had back then, betraying our marriage. Perhaps she sees me all alone and thinks I still love her deeply, just like I did back then. She probably believes that even if she cheated on me and divorced me, I would still wait for her to come back. Little does she know, I have already remarried, and even our child is already 3 years old. Chapter 1. Flora chose to confront me because she found out she was pregnant. The ultrasound showed that the gestational sac was at 8 weeks plus, and I had just returned from a business trip of over 3 months. Naturally, the child couldn't be mine. Flora sat across from me with a cold demeanor as she confessed that she had cheated on me 6 months ago. She refused to reveal who her affair partner was, but she mentioned that she wanted to keep the child and give her affair partner a sense of legitimacy. Of course, this meant we would have to get divorced. I couldn't believe my ears. I wondered if I had misheard. How could I, who had been faithful, have been deceived for 6 months? Before I could ask any questions, it seemed like Flora already knew what I wanted to say. She looked into my eyes and emotionlessly said, "You heard correctly." I stared at the woman I had loved for 5 years, feeling as if my heart had been pierced by needles. The pain spread intensely, making me feel unsteady on my feet. I had never imagined that my marriage would encounter such problems. Flora was beautiful, but she had a cold personality and was slow to warm up to people. She was known as the ice queen during our school days, and many boys liked her. It took me 2 relentless years to win her over. I truly loved her. After spending so many years together, even though she had never explicitly said she loved me, I had assumed she had grown accustomed to my presence. Not long after graduating from university, we got married. 3 years of dating, 2 years of marriage, and within just 5 years of being together, she cheated? I couldn't accept this reality. I even started to go mad, trying to find reasons for her infidelity. I wanted to say that I couldn't live without her, that I couldn't bear the thought of divorcing her. But as I looked at Flora's indifferent face, I suddenly stopped. I introspected and asked myself, even if Flora, who had cheated, agreed to return to our family and continue our life together, would I still want that? I didn't want it. Of course, I didn't want it. Flora had cheated, and she was carrying someone else's child. She no longer deserved to be with me. Chapter 2. Flora still doesn't understand me after all these years, she only knows how much I love her. Perhaps because of this, maybe she was afraid of my persistence, she quickly left after saying the word divorce and made a phone call, leaving me alone to digest it all. She didn't come back until the next morning. I spent the whole night on the balcony, feeling the cool breeze and thinking all night, but I still couldn't understand why Flora would cheat on me. Flora came from a good family, and she was the only daughter. After graduating, she took over the declining family business. Because of this, she has been busy for the past 2 years, hardly having any time to rest. Working during the day and socializing at night had become her routine. I couldn't understand how she could find time to have an affair with such a busy schedule. Perhaps my work was also busy, constantly traveling for business, and I didn't have enough time to spend with her. But that couldn't be a reason for her to cheat. When Flora came back, she stood silently at the entrance, looking at me, or rather, at the cigarette butts on the ground. There was no change in her expression, she couldn't understand the impact her infidelity had on me. I looked at her from the living room, her radiant beauty contrasting with my disheveled appearance. I started to reflect on why I was punishing myself with her mistakes. I don't know how long it took, but I heard Flora ask, "Have you figured it out?" Figured it out? Looking back at these 5 years together, occasional arguments, no matter whose fault it was, I was always the first to compromise, she never once bowed down. Not even once. I sneered, stubbed out the cigarette butt on the ground with my foot, choosing to ignore the tingling pain in my leg, and raised my chin to ask Flora, why? Why did she cheat? Knowing each other for 7 years, being together for 5, last night I imagined countless reasons why Flora would ask for a divorce. As long as it wasn't infidelity, I would consider forgiving her, but she chose to cheat. And infidelity alone is unforgivable. Flora nonchalantly avoided my gaze, with a hint of impatience in her eyes. "There's no why, Ivan. Our fate has come to an end. Can't we part amicably? What a statement, our fate has come to an end, part amicably. Fine, I forced a smile, pulling at the corners of my mouth, let's get divorced. Perhaps I agreed too readily, it didn't match my usual image of being submissive. Flora stared at me with a hint of surprise for a moment, her lips moved, but she didn't say anything in the end. Chapter 3. Because of my agreement, the road to divorce went smoothly. We didn't even inform our parents, hastily obtaining the divorce certificate, just like when we got married. Regarding the division of our joint property, I naturally fought for what was rightfully mine. Flora and her adulterous partner shouldn't benefit from my assets. Flora was unwilling to make any concessions, but she was at fault in the marriage, and her connections in City H were far inferior to mine. She couldn't possibly win against me. In the end, she reluctantly gave up half of our savings, only asking me to leave the house for her. She bit her lip, a hint of humiliation in her expression. Ivan, you earn more than me, and I'll have to support our child in the future. At least I should have a house. I sneered, what about your lover? Can't he provide you with a house? Judging by Flora's expression, I probably hit the mark. The house was our marital home, and both our families contributed when we bought it. After calculating our savings, I realized that it was pointless to continue fighting. I eventually agreed to let her keep the house, but she had to make concessions regarding our savings. Flora stared at me for a long time, as if she didn't recognize me anymore. Of course, she didn't know the me who no longer loved her. After 2 years of marriage, I didn't have much luggage. I left with my belongings, without looking back. Flora didn't seem too upset about it. It was precisely because of this that I suddenly wanted to see the person she cheated on me with, to see how great he was to make Flora do the most despicable thing in her life. But I managed to resist the urge to look. Since we were already divorced, the best respect for our past relationship was to not disturb each other. On the second day after the divorce, I received a WeChat message from Flora's cousin, asking who the guy was that Flora went home with. The message was followed by 3 laughing emojis with hands covering the mouth. I stared at those words for a long time, finally feeling at ease. I replied indifferently, you should ask your cousin that question. After sending that message, I deleted Helen's WeChat contact. Helen never liked me, and sending that message was just to intentionally make me feel uncomfortable. I couldn't let her have her way. People were bustling on the busy street, and I stood amidst the crowd, as if I had lost my way home. At that moment, I realized that perhaps it was time to leave this city. Chapter 4. The next day, I submitted my resignation letter to the company. After years of struggling in this city, I had established a place for myself in the company, but suddenly, I didn't want to stay here anymore. I came to this city in the first place because of Flora, and now I wanted to leave because of her as well. Thinking back, during the first half of my short youth, I revolved around Flora almost entirely. No wonder she grew tired of me. After quitting my job, I visited several tourist spots in this city, spending a month before preparing to depart for my destination. 2 hours before boarding the plane, Flora suddenly called. It had been over a month since our divorce, and we had cut off all contact. There was no reason for Flora to reach out, let alone initiate the contact. Flora's calm voice came through the phone receiver, I heard you're leaving the city? I mocked, you seem well informed. There was silence on the other end of the line. After a while, Flora coldly said, do as you please. With that, she hung up. To be honest, if Flora had spoken to me in that tone before, I would have already prepared her favorite gift and stood downstairs at her company, begging for her forgiveness. Times have changed. Today is different from the past. Flora wouldn't still think I would indulge her like before, would she? How ridiculous. I stared at my phone expressionlessly for a while, then walked into a nearby service center before leaving, canceling my number. From now on, I didn't want any contact with Flora. Chapter 5. I was born in a small county town where development is slower, and life isn't as fast-paced as in many cities. As soon as my 80-year-old grandmother saw me, she tightly held my hand, repeatedly looking at me and scolding me for not eating properly and losing weight. I slowed down my pace, walking home with her, accompanied by the lingering glow of the sunset. Just like when I was young. Looking at my grandmother's graying hair and her hunched back that couldn't straighten up, a belated sense of heartache spread through me. For all those years I chased after Flora, did my dearest grandmother also hover at the village entrance, waiting to see if that familiar figure would step off the bus? I was raised by my grandmother, and my relationship with my parents wasn't deep. I didn't even inform them about my divorce and returning from H-City after resigning. So, on the 12th day of my return, the neighbor from next door came to find my grandmother with a phone in hand. When she looked at me with a complex gaze, I instantly understood that it was my parents calling. As my grandmother handed me the phone, my mother was angrily roaring on the other end. I hung up the call expressionlessly. Less than a minute later, the phone rang again, and I just made a sound before the roaring voice on the other end became even louder. I hung up the call again. After 4 or 5 times like this, my mother finally calmed down. She no longer shouted loudly but asked me for my new phone number, saying that I didn't even tell her about such a big thing as the divorce and questioning what was going on in my head. I pursed my lips and calmly told her, "I've been divorced for almost 2 months now, and this time you remembered me sooner than last time." There was a choke on the other end, and then there was silence. When I was young, my family didn't have good conditions, so my parents decided to go out and make a living after I was born, leaving me with my grandmother. After a few years, they earned some money, but they also had a new child by their side, my younger brother. The reason for having another child was because I wasn't close to them. Later, during the summer vacation, they also tried to bring me closer by having me stay with them. At that time, my brother was 6 years old, and I was 11. At that age, I was already disinterested in competing for toys with younger children. But my brother, whom I had barely seen, had a hostile attitude towards me. I absent-mindedly placed the Ultraman toy that he randomly threw on the couch onto the table. When my parents returned from work, some of those Ultraman toys were mysteriously missing arms or legs. My brother held onto the incomplete Ultraman toy, his mouth twisted, and he cried silently. He knew that our parents favored him. Sure enough, the look my parents gave me was incredibly complicated. I tried to explain that I didn't do it. To this day, I still remember that moment of helplessness. My mother waved her hand dismissively and said, all right, I know you didn't do it." Turning her head, she whispered to my father, thinking that I couldn't hear her, "How did this child turn out like this because of you?" My father remained silent, clearly acknowledging that I was responsible for what happened. Afterward, they bought more toys, but those toys were locked in a storage room, and only the 3 of them had the keys. I have some allergies to seafood, and my grandmother remembered it very well. Seafood never appeared on the dining table at home. Before I was brought to their house, my grandmother reminded my mother not to let me touch any seafood. My mother nodded in agreement. But on the 3rd day of my arrival, I ended up in the hospital because of a bowl of seafood porridge. In the emergency room, struggling to breathe, I could hear my parents arguing in the adjacent room. My mother said, "How was I supposed to know he was allergic to seafood?" My father's voice sounded helpless. "Didn't Grandma tell you when she came?" "She said so many things, how was I supposed to remember?" My mother's voice became sharp. "Besides, he's grown up now. Shouldn't he know what he can and can't eat? I think he's just being greedy. If his brother wants to eat, isn't it a loss if he doesn't eat too?" And now, their anger shouldn't be because I divorced Flora without telling them, but because I quit my high-paying and stable job. They're afraid that without a job, I will compete with my brother for the family business. Otherwise, how could they think of calling me? Chapter 6. It was quite a surprise that my parents rushed back on that same evening. Following behind them was my college-going younger brother, and we locked eyes. The gleeful satisfaction in his eyes hadn't even had a chance to fade. After more than 2 years apart, my parents looked much older. The wrinkles around their eyes were visible even when they weren't smiling, and there were more lines around their mouths. Especially my mother's expression, it seemed somewhat harsh. Mother paid no attention to my grandmother's cheerful greetings and instead gave me a cold glance. Before she even sat down, she angrily scolded, "Ivan, so you think you've grown wings? Getting a divorce and quitting your job without even discussing it with us? Grandmother was shocked by this news, looking at her, then at me. Her lips murmured a few times but didn't say anything. I knew well that our family bonds were shallow, and I felt no waves of emotion inside me. I just looked at my half-burnt cigarette between my fingertips, saying nothing. My mother couldn't stand seeing me in this state. Her voice became sharp. "Ivan, is this how you treat your own mother? Utterly uncultured. No wonder your marriage failed, you." Seeing her becoming more and more unreasonable, my father suddenly reached out and pulled her back. He clicked his tongue, seeming displeased. "You've lost your mind. How can you say such things about our child?" Mother realized her mistake but couldn't bring herself to apologize to me. She snorted and turned her face away. Father looked at me with some difficulty, as if expecting me to apologize to my mother. "Ha! I'm the one being scolded, and I'm expected to apologize? On what grounds? Are children born indebted to their parents?" Grandmother brought some tea and quietly said to my parents, "You should talk things out properly with the child." Mother cast a disdainful glance at her. "What do you know? I see that Ivan's audacity is all you're doing." She was used to using grandmother as an outlet for her frustrations. In order to maintain family harmony, grandmother always silently endured. I dropped the cigarette butt on the ground and flicked it with my toe before turning to look at my father. I asked him, "How did you know I came back?" Father chuckled awkwardly. "Little Flora called me and your mother, saying that she couldn't reach you for a while, and she was worried." I pursed my lips and suddenly found it amusing. She was the one who cheated, who got pregnant with someone else's child. She was the one who brought up the idea of divorce, saying that our fate had come to an end. I have no intention of clinging onto anything between us. We must sever ties cleanly. So, why is she contacting me now? Mother was still there, rambling on about how good Flora was, praising her every little virtue, and subtly insinuating that I had a bad personality. It was good enough that Flora tolerated me, and so on. I listened to her belittling me, comparing me to Flora, without any expression on my face. And as she finished digging up all the old grievances about me, she concluded that there must be something wrong with my brain, saying that if we're getting a divorce, why would I give up my job too? Yes, if one's brain is normal, they wouldn't be here listening to her babble on and on. But deep down, an unattainable hope still lingered. Chapter 7. No matter how my mother verbally attacked me, whether I divorce Flora or quit my job, there is no room for regret. On the day when I received no comfort after being out in the cold wind all night, I suddenly woke up. I still have a long life ahead of me, so why waste it on someone who doesn't love me? In the end, my mother couldn't accept it. She said that during this short period of unemployment, I should seize the opportunity to find a new job. Father also agreed with this suggestion and joined my mother in urging me to find a job as soon as possible. He mentioned that the field I studied in college doesn't align with the family business. Their greed to prevent me from competing for the family business was so apparent. Pressing my slightly throbbing forehead, I interrupted their discussion. "Have you said enough?" Both my parents turned their heads to look at me, and even my younger brother, who had been watching the scene unfold, looked surprised. For so many years, I had always been easygoing. I had never defied or contradicted my parents, and it was precisely because of this that my mother could belittle me so brazenly. But today, I suddenly didn't want to tolerate it anymore. I didn't feel like beating around the bush and calmly said, "If you're done talking, let's leave. Buy your return tickets while they're still available." My mother stared at me and then pointed her finger at my face, once again launching into a torrent of insults. She called me an ungrateful child, said my nature was cold-hearted. I glanced at her, stood up, and walked out. Cold-heartedness can be inherited. And my cold-hearted nature, I inherited from them. No wonder others. I found a hotel in town and settled in. Just as I finished settling down, Flora called. I had no idea how she got hold of my new number. I looked at those 11 digits that I knew by heart, hesitated for a moment, and decided not to answer. Flora wasn't discouraged and quickly made a second call, then a third. After the divorce, her patience towards me seemed to have improved compared to before. But this woman, does she have to be so shameless? When she called for the 7th time, I answered. There was no sound on the other end of the line, only Flora's steady breathing. I didn't speak either. I lowered my gaze and watched the call duration changing continuously, waiting for it to start with a 2. Once it did, I interrupted the silence. Fate has come to an end, and we should part ways amicably. Those were your words. I don't have the habit of lingering with ex-wives, Flora. Don't come looking for me, no matter what. There was still silence on the other end. I didn't wait for Flora's response. After hanging up the phone, I casually added her to the blacklist. Even when we were married, Flora didn't treat me well, but now that we're divorced, she's suddenly contacting me more frequently. What's the matter? Not used to losing a lapdog like me? Perhaps that's possible. After all, I meticulously cared for her for 5 years, attending to every detail. Chapter 8. I understand my parents. After going through tough times, they especially didn't want to go back to that life. Otherwise, we wouldn't have grown distant from each other. Since our family business relies on people, this time when they came back, they would only stay for 2 or 3 days at most. I really didn't want to see them, and the only solution was not to go back. I turned off my phone and stayed in a hotel in town for 7 days. On the evening of the 7th day, Grandma, leaning on her old cane, made her way to me. This elderly woman in her 80s took slow, small steps from the village to the town. I could even imagine how she asked around and searched to find me. Grandma's graying hair was illuminated by the setting sun, and her mouth, with only a few teeth left, smiled at me. She said, "Ivan, they've left. Grandma will take you home." I was reminded of when I was young. No matter how late I finished my night self-study, she would always wait for me at the village entrance to bring me home. I thought I had experienced so much and should have outgrown being tearful, but in that moment, as I looked at Grandma, who was hunched over and almost 2 heads shorter than me, I couldn't help but tear up. After going back home with Grandma, I turned on my phone. As expected, my parents sent me numerous messages on WeChat, scolding me for being immature and irresponsible, both directly and indirectly. I couldn't be bothered to open and read them. Flora also sent me a message from an unfamiliar phone number. In essence, she wanted me to live a good life, and this time she just wanted to make sure I was safe. After all, we were once husband and wife. She wouldn't bother me anymore in the future, and we would each live our own lives. Live our own lives? To be honest, I certainly didn't wish for someone who betrayed our marriage to live a good life. I couldn't wish her well. But the 7-digit balance in my bank account gave me confidence. I wanted to see vast mountains and rivers, to see lakes and hills, and to witness the sunrise and sunset. Chapter 9. During the 3rd month of traveling with Grandma, I encountered a senior schoolmate from high school in her hometown. I vaguely remembered that she had excellent grades back then. Not only was she beautiful, but she also had a well-proportioned figure. During that adolescent phase, she was the goddess of most of the boys in our dormitory. However, I had heard that she had a somewhat introverted personality, few friends around her, and didn't like getting too close to people. During high school, I hardly had any interaction with her, just knowing that there was such a person. Later on, we both entered the same university, and inevitably crossed paths a few times, but it was merely a nodding acquaintance. Carrying a camera and traveling with a simple backpack, she wandered alone. Unlike her pale and sickly appearance before, her skin now had a healthy wheatish tone, and her fully developed figure couldn't be hidden even under loose sportswear. Unlike Flora's aggressive beauty, her beauty was approachable. Her gentle nature was irresistible. Meeting an old acquaintance in a foreign land, combined with the fact that we were heading to the same destination next, we decided to travel together. She didn't talk much, showed respect for the elderly, observed others' words and expressions, and knew how to make the elderly happy. Grandma really liked her. One night, Grandma and I sat together in reclining chairs, gazing at the stars through the skylight. Suddenly, Grandma said, "That Mary girl is quite nice." I instantly understood what Grandma meant and awkwardly chuckled twice, saying, "Yes, she is." When it comes to the love between parents and children, the thoughts of elderly people are always more sensitive. But between me and my schoolmate, Although we shared common interests, there was an insurmountable gap between us. I admired her, but that didn't mean I liked her. Besides, I'd been divorced, so there's no way I could be a match for her. Chapter 10. Grandma is getting older, so whenever we arrive at a new place, she needs to rest for 2 days to recover. Because of this, I worry that it will delay my schoolmate's progress, and I always think about letting her go first. Regarding my suggestion, my schoolmate did not refuse, she just smiled and said, "It's fine to separate at the next stop. I also want to stay here for a few more days." The misty and rainy southern region, with its ancient town, is as beautiful as a painting. Being in such a beautiful scenery, my mood brightened up a lot, and I couldn't help but take a few more glances at my schoolmate. I had known for a long time that she was different from Flora's ostentatious appearance. My schoolmate was elegant and charming, with soft features. She exuded a scholarly aura, giving the impression that she was someone easy to get along with. Sensing my gaze, my schoolmate smiled gently. The rolling mountains in the distance were reflected in her half-curved black eyes, giving a sense of openness. The winding paths of the ancient town were covered in layers of thin white mist, stirred up by the drizzling rain, creating a fairyland-like scene. I told Grandma that I wanted to go out for a walk. Grandma, being old, didn't want to walk much. She sat under the same eaves as the elderly ladies of the town who were around her age. They spoke their own version of Mandarin dialect, not knowing if the other understood or not. As they got more excited, they couldn't help but burst into laughter, and soon they all laughed together. I stood not far away and watched for a while, hearing footsteps approaching from a distance. I turned my head and looked. In the hazy misty rain, my schoolmate walked towards me with a jade-handled umbrella in her hand. She stood beside me, her movements gentle and as smooth as water, a sight I had never seen before. My schoolmate asked me if I wanted to go out for a walk together. It suited my intentions perfectly. I took the umbrella from her hand and tilted it slightly towards her direction. She was about a head shorter than me, but her walking pace was not slower than mine. We strolled together in the ancient town with its green tiles and red bricks. My schoolmate didn't speak much, and many of our conversations were initiated by me. She listened attentively and answered my questions with precision, as if she was trying to find the perfect answer. It was quite interesting. Looking at her delicate profile, I felt a hint of indiscernible regret in my heart. It's a pity that I have long passed the age of being moved. Chapter 11. My schoolmate and I parted ways at the next stop. Since then, I have crossed 3 mountains and passed through 2 lakes, but I have never seen her again. I went out with Grandma in early winter, and when we returned, it was already late summer. Grandma had a much brighter smile on her face. She walked with a cane and talked incessantly, telling everyone about the vast mountains and rivers she had seen during this time. There were several elderly people in the village who were around the same age as Grandma. Despite her limited vocabulary in describing things, they all showed longing and envy in their expressions. There were also some people who couldn't bear to see Grandma happy. After meals, they would always hint and ask me about marriage or work-related matters. Grandma's smile froze on her face, and after a while, she let out a sigh. "Young people's affairs, we can't control them," she waved her hand and said. The old lady who initiated the conversation gave me a meaningful look, and the topic was then dropped. Chapter 12. After resting at home for a few days, I started to have new plans for my life. My parents' worries were completely unnecessary. I had no interest in the family business. I had grown tired of the cutthroat battles in the market where there was no sign of swords or knives. I wanted to settle down and cultivate myself. In college, I studied civil engineering. I didn't excel in my own courses, but I often audited agricultural classes. In this small town in the countryside, the most abundant resource is land. I contracted a few acres and planned to grow flowers to sell. In recent years, many people have been paying more attention to festivals, and there is a high demand for flowers. Combined with my desire to settle down and cultivate myself, there seemed to be no better way than growing plants and flowers. In the following days, Helen contacted me a few times through her friend's WeChat. She was trying to test if I had truly forgotten about her cousin. I had once loved so deeply, and leaving so freely, in their eyes, was nothing more than a strategic retreat. I wasted a lot of time on Flora and invested even more of my emotions. The cost of leaving was sacrificing so many years of my youth, and the price was indeed quite high. During that period, the land I had contracted needed to have plastic greenhouses built, so I had no time to pay attention to her, nor did I want to. Eventually, it just faded away. I wasn't that clueless. At the very least, I knew when to cut my losses. Just as the plastic greenhouses were about to be completed, an old acquaintance visited my home. She sat in the yard talking to Grandma, her figure slender, with the evening sun casting a gentle and beautiful glow on her profile. As if sensing something, my schoolmate glanced at me from the corner of her eye and gave me a faint smile. "Passing by here, I thought I'd come and see you." My heart, which had been silent for so long, suddenly skipped a beat uncontrollably, but soon returned to its usual rhythm. Chapter 13. After my schoolmate came to stay, she never mentioned the idea of leaving again. Every morning after that, she would accompany me as we left together, carrying her camera and following behind me, capturing moments along the way. Sometimes I would walk quite far, and she would stay in one spot. I would then stop and wait for her. I knew she enjoyed the scenery here, enough to be willing to pause her steps. When we reached the flower fields, she would show me the captured landscapes and we would admire them together. With the morning mist in wisps of cooking smoke, the fields intertwined, and the houses scattered amidst the green mountains and blue waters. The town's scenery held a unique charm. Suddenly, I snapped out of my thoughts and realized that we had unknowingly gotten so close to each other. We exchanged a glance, then quickly averted our eyes in a flustered manner. I noticed a faint blush on her cheeks. Finally, I belatedly realized that something was amiss. So, on the day the flowers broke through the soil, I invited my schoolmate to have a small drink in the wooden cabin in the flower field. As the alcohol took effect, I poured out all the entanglements I had with Flora over these years. My schoolmate was momentarily taken aback. How could such an intelligent person not understand the underlying meaning behind my words? After a moment, she let out a low sigh. Under the dim, yellowish light, she looked at me intently. "You don't have to say it, I already know." But she didn't want to say how she knew. After the fervent love for Flora faded away, I didn't know if I still had the ability to love someone else. But I knew it shouldn't be now. Perhaps I was overthinking, and my schoolmate might not have any ulterior motives. Chapter 14. The flowers planted at the end of summer sprouted new buds in early autumn, and in the harsh winter, a tiny flower bud blossomed. My schoolmate's camera captured every stage of their growth. She transformed from a travel blogger who wanted to explore vast mountains and rivers into a plant care blogger, and she found joy in it. Habit is a terrifying thing, but I have to admit that in just a few months of being together, I have grown accustomed to my schoolmate's presence. Like a gentle spring breeze and drizzling rain, silently nourishing everything. And in a hurry, a new year has come. On the day of the beginning of spring, the roses in the plastic greenhouse bloomed. The stunning roses exuded a lingering fragrance, rich and long-lasting. I picked one and held it in my palm, observing it carefully. Unbeknownst to me, my schoolmate, who had been taking photos of the roses just moments ago, approached. She leaned slightly and joined me in admiring the rose in my hand. We were too close, and the scent of soap lingers in the air, refreshing and pleasant. Compared to her excessively beautiful appearance, even the enchanting rose seemed to pale in comparison. In that moment, I don't know what came over me. I suddenly handed her the rose in my hand, saying, "Schoolmate, do you like roses? Do you like roses? Do you like me, who was giving you this rose?" My schoolmate was taken aback, her gaze lowered to the rose I held up. Then, she looked at me with a steady gaze, as if her deep black eyes were filled with boundless affection. After a while, she took the rose from my hand, lowered her head, gently sniffed its fragrance, and then she smiled softly, saying, "I do." "What do you like? Is it the rose, or could it possibly be me?" I stared at her in a daze, completely forgetting to ask, only knowing that in this moment, the vast sea of flowers couldn't compare to the beauty of her gentle brows and eyes. Boom! I heard a loud noise as the towering wall around my heart collapsed. Chapter 15. I am not incapable of love. After confirming my own feelings, I solemnly confessed to my senior at the end of March. She showed no surprise on her face, and she accepted my feelings without any hesitation. Our relationship didn't change after that, and we continued to be together for half a year. My senior's gentle personality remained the same as when we first met. My grandmother was even happier than me and showered my senior with more affection. After March, my flower business thrived both online and offline, and there were no issues with unsold products. My parents called me after learning about my flower business. Perhaps they realized that I had a high chance of not competing with my younger brother for the family business. My mother's tone was somewhat calm, but she still subtly criticized me for being unsuccessful. In their eyes, what potential could there be in growing flowers? I don't know why my biological parents harbor such ill will towards me, so I have chosen not to let their words affect me anymore. Calmly, I said, "Since you dislike me so much, let's pretend I was never born." My mother's incessant words abruptly stopped. My father quickly took the phone and scolded me for not being mature at my age. I chuckled and said, "Well, at least you still have an obedient and well-behaved son." Now they have one more, indeed. My father sighed and told me to calm down before hanging up the phone. I took a deep breath of the fragrant air filled with the scent of flowers. I turned to see my senior running towards me, holding a bouquet of baby's breath. She touched her nose nervously and asked if I still liked them. My senior is perceptive; even when I appear calm, she can sense my unhappiness. I lowered my gaze to the flowers and suddenly remembered the flower language of baby's breath, silently guarding love. I still remember in the past, when I had conflicts and disagreements with my parents, Flora would always frown at me and even criticize me for having a bad temper. I leaned down and embraced my senior. I could feel her body stiffen for a moment before she tightened her arms around my waist. Being so close, I could hear her heartbeat, beating faster and faster. Suddenly, I became enamored with this warmth. Chapter 16. In the 6th year of our relationship, my senior and I celebrated our daughter's 3rd birthday. She will be starting kindergarten in September. My senior is also from H City, and due to some household registration issues, we both had to return to H City this time. It has been 6 years since my divorce with Flora, and in these 6 years, I haven't heard any news from her or returned to H City. But the main task at hand was important. After arriving in H City, my senior and I went straight to the local police station. She took our daughter to handle the household registration matters, and during the waiting process, I felt the urge to smoke. After greeting my senior, I walked out of the police station and found a quiet place to smoke. After taking a few puffs, I casually looked around, and my gaze suddenly stopped at a street corner. I saw a familiar figure. After 6 years, seeing each other again, I almost instinctively wanted to lift my foot and leave. But the next second, Flora looked up. Her gaze passed by me, and then she suddenly turned her head to look back. We locked eyes from a distance, and I took a deep drag of the cigarette in my hand, showing no expression on my face. Flora and I were already the most familiar strangers. We would no longer have any intersection in the future. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Flora standing in a daze for a moment, and then she took big steps towards me. I didn't want to get involved with her, so I extinguished the cigarette in my hand and turned around, ready to leave. But Flora called out to me from behind, "Ivan." I furrowed my brows and finally stopped in my tracks. Flora walked briskly towards me, standing in front of me, staring at me intently for a long time. After a while, she hesitantly asked me, "When did you come back?" Come back? I had no intention of engaging in conversation with her. My senior and our daughter were still waiting for me. I simply said, "Is there something you need? If there's nothing, then don't block my path." I never expected that as soon as I asked that question, Flora's eyes would turn red. Flora has always been proud and rarely shed tears in front of me. But what does it have to do with me? Impatiently, I clicked my tongue and was about to tell her to get out of my way. However, unexpectedly, Flora suddenly said, "Ivan, I regret it." This nonsensical statement made my brows furrow even tighter. Flora's eyes became even redder as she said she regretted her affair and betraying our marriage. It took me a while to understand. She must have seen that I am alone now and thought that I still love her deeply, just like in the past. Even though she cheated on me and divorced me, she probably thought I would still be waiting for her to come back. Flora is too confident. In her mind, my role as a loyal follower cannot be shaken. Little did she know that I had already remarried, and even our child is 3 years old. At that moment, I suddenly wanted to see Flora's reaction when she finds out that I am married and have a child. Chapter 17. I didn't have to wait long. I heard the voices of my senior and our daughter. Ivan? Daddy! Flora froze, swiftly turning her head towards the direction of the voice. She saw my senior, perhaps recognizing her too, as her face turned pale in an instant. She looked at my senior and my daughter for a moment, then turned her head towards me in disbelief. Her lower lip trembled slightly, unable to utter a complete sentence. My daughter broke free from my senior's hand and ran towards me. I bent down and scooped her up in my arms. She hugged my neck tightly, burying her little head on my shoulder, continuously calling me daddy in her sweet voice. I gently patted her back in a soothing manner, then looked at Flora. 6 years have passed, and she hasn't changed much. She still has a tall and stunning figure. The only difference is that she seems more mature now, unlike the cold goddess she used to be. The Flora I see now has a kind of intellectual beauty. This beauty comes from within, radiating the wisdom and beauty of time. Meeting again, I didn't exchange pleasantries with her, nor did I show any signs of being tired of seeing her. Any affection or resentment I had towards her had already dissipated over the course of those 6 years. Flora's gaze fell upon our daughter, lingering there without ever leaving. Her expression was too complex, and her half-lowered eyes concealed all the surging emotions within them. I inexplicably understood her complex emotions. Perhaps she realized that the backup she thought was waiting for her hasn't remained in the same spot. Ha! What kind of mindset is that? After being separated for so many years, we have both formed new families. No ripples of the past love can be stirred up again. After a moment of silence, I mercilessly asked her, "So, is your marriage unhappy?" Serves her right. This is the retribution all cheaters deserve. Before Flora could answer, my senior walked over. Even the tone of her voice when greeting Flora was gentle. "Oh, it's our junior. It's been a long time." Flora clenched her hand hanging by her side into a slow fist. She forced out a smile that was more ugly than crying as she looked at my senior. Our daughter softly called Mommy against my shoulder. My senior touched her little head, wearing an extremely doting smile. For some reason, a feeling called satisfaction welled up within me. Holding my senior's hand, I turned to Flora and said, "This is my wife." Flora's gaze dropped, landing on the tightly clasped hands of me and my senior. Her eyes seemed to blend into an indiscernible darkness. Chapter 18. My senior comforted our daughter for a while before looking at me. She gently shook the hand we were holding together and asked me softly, "Shall we go?" I nodded. Just as we turned around and took a few steps, we ran into another familiar face, Michael. I still remember his excellent grades during our school days. He was Flora's biggest rival throughout her student career. What left a deep impression on me was that they hated each other due to some competition. In school, besides participating in competitions together, they seemed to have no other interactions. Even when they crossed paths, they would avoid each other's gaze and pretend not to see each other. When Michael saw me, he clearly froze for a moment, then awkwardly pursed his lips and avoided my gaze, looking to his right. He was holding a boy of about 6 or 7 years old by his right hand. When the boy saw Flora, he broke free from Michael's hand and ran towards Flora, calling her Mommy. Oh, I see now. In that instant, what else is there for me not to understand? I turned to look at Flora. Flora bit her lip, turned her head away, and dared not meet my gaze. My senior tightened her grip on my hand. I calmly turned back to her and flashed a reassuring smile, continuing to walk forward with her. As we passed by Michael, I heard his voice. "Ivan, congratulations." I was taken aback for a moment, then coldly laughed and said, "Thanks for making it happen." Ha, the third party who once intervened in my marriage, What right does she have to pretend to be affectionate in front of me? Those who abandoned me yesterday should not be kept. Chapter 19. After returning from H City, our family of 3 resumed our ordinary and fulfilling life, with a touch of sweetness. Both my senior and I tacitly avoided mentioning Flora. One day, about half a month later, as I looked up while pruning the branches of flowers, I saw my senior holding our daughter, her face filled with a deep expression as she gazed out the window. My senior has always been gentle, and after years of being together, it was the first time I saw such an expression on her face. Subconsciously, I followed her gaze and saw a familiar figure standing outside the window. Flora was standing in the yard, talking to her grandmother, but her eyes occasionally glanced towards our window. No wonder my senior's face was so gloomy. But why did Flora suddenly come here? After comforting our daughter, my senior glanced at me and said, "Don't go out," before pushing the door open and walking out. Through the window, I watched her conversing with Flora. These 2 women of similar age exuded different qualities, each with their own unique charm. I glanced past Flora and looked at my senior. Once my gaze fell upon her, I couldn't look away. In my memory, my senior has always been gentle and caring. I had never seen her in such a tense state, filled with hostility. I continued to watch her for a while, not even realizing that a smile had formed on my lips. When my senior entered the house, my smile at the corner of my mouth hadn't had a chance to fade. She visibly paused, her bright black eyes deepening slightly, and she asked me with an unclear meaning, "Are you so happy?" Understanding that she had misunderstood my intentions, I calmly explained, "Well, I've never seen you harbor such animosity towards anyone before." My senior's complexion improved slightly upon hearing my words. She lifted our daughter, who was playing with building blocks, and leaned against my shoulder, her voice tinged with helplessness. "Go out and talk to her, clear things up." After a pause, she added softly, "Don't get into a fight." Chapter 20. I stood under the grapevine in the yard, facing Flora. In just half a month, she looked much more haggard. Perhaps due to her hurried arrival, her clothes were wrinkled in several places. This was not the clean and neat Flora that I remembered. She just stared at me silently, not saying a word, the air filled with silence and tension. Perhaps unable to bear the atmosphere, Grandma stood up, leaning on her cane, and said that it was a bit stuffy in the yard and she wanted to go for a walk. Once Grandma had walked away, I broke the silence first and asked, "Flora, even though so many years have passed, I still have a question I want to ask you." A glimmer of hope seemed to ignite in Flora's lifeless eyes. I guessed that she probably thought I was going to ask if she had ever loved me. Ha! How shallow. Clearing my throat, I leaned in closer and asked in a low voice, "Did it taste good when you cheated?" Flora froze in place, her face showing a mix of shock and helplessness. Even her delicate makeup couldn't conceal the turmoil in her expression. A sense of satisfaction surged within me. I saw Flora's fingers gripping the vine, turning pale. "I'm sorry." She finally uttered an apology that was 6 years too late, and added, I thought. The rest of her words seemed to be stuck in her throat. Thought what? Did she think that I loved her so deeply that even after divorcing, I would silently protect and watch over her from a place she didn't know? But Flora, in this world, no one owes anyone anything. How can you still not understand that even after reaching middle age? I remained silent, looking at her with a cold and indifferent gaze. We parted ways, each finding our own happiness. Regardless of her motives, it was unreasonable for her to come looking for me. But in the 6th year after our divorce, she decided to come find me. Flora and I locked eyes, with bloodshot eyes in hers. Finally, she said, "Ivan, you probably won't believe it, but after divorcing you, I truly regretted." I was taken aback, but then I slowly smiled. So what? No one knows better than me that Flora's regret is not genuine. She only feels uncomfortable seeing me living a good life after leaving her, even happier than when we were together. It's just her own dissatisfaction. In other words, even if Flora truly regrets it, so what? Why does she think that after giving me such a humiliating cuckoldry experience, she can come to me years later and say she regrets it? Don't talk to me about prodigal sons returning. The thing I look down upon the most in my life is a prodigal son who returns. Chapter 21. After 6 years of not seeing each other, Flora still had the audacity to say such words to me. She relied on the unique favoritism I once had for her. I loved her wholeheartedly, and she couldn't believe that I could easily let her go. But when she truly realized the loss, it was something she couldn't accept. Perhaps these years of farming and cultivating flowers have tempered my temperament, and I am ultimately more open-minded than her. I have no intention of engaging in further conversation with her and only urge her to leave sooner. She already has a new family, yet she deliberately came here to find me, betraying her new family. She betrayed me back then, and now she wants to betray her family again? Flora left my house but didn't leave this small town. She found a hotel in town, and every morning, she would stand at a distance, looking towards my direction. Day by day, her face grew darker, but she tried her best not to show her emotions in front of me and our daughter. Finally, one night, while I was sound asleep, she quietly dressed and left. After she left, I got up and secretly followed her. Sure enough, she had arranged to meet with Flora. I crouched below the window, eavesdropping on their conversation. After a moment of silence, Flora spoke first. Before I came here, Michael had already told me everything. Our reunion is connected to you. I was taken aback for a moment but quickly composed myself. Oh, so this is what caused Flora's breakdown. My ex-wife remained silent. Then, I heard Flora grit her teeth and say, "What a clever scheme." Another moment of silence followed. I quietly stood up and looked into the room through the gap in the window. So what? My ex-wife stood in the shadow of the bright light, and from my angle, I couldn't see her expression clearly, but I heard her emotionless voice say, "The one who was despicable in the beginning, wasn't it you?" Flora froze in place. "You knew?" Of course, I knew, my ex-wife sneered, her voice filled with sarcasm. I started liking Ivan when I was 18, and by the time I turned 28, my affection for him had only grown. And you, on the other hand. You have restless genes deep within you. If it hadn't been Michael, there would have been someone else in the future. Being with Ivan was like being in deep water in fire. He saved me back then, so naturally, I had to save him. What if Ivan finds out? Flora's voice seemed to carry a hint of anticipation. If Ivan finds out that you once plotted against his marriage, can you guarantee that he won't hold any grudges? For a moment, my senior emerged from the dark shadow, her face showing a mix of ambiguity. I heard her say, "I was saving him." How can that be considered a plot? Chapter 22. The next day, when I saw Flora again, I walked towards her. Before she could speak, I got straight to the point. "I heard everything you said last night." A glimmer of hope appeared in Flora's eyes. She pursed her lips and her voice sounded somewhat dry. "Ivan, there was nothing between Michael and me, everything was." I interrupted her with a cold tone. "Our marriage was never happy to begin with. You never truly cared for me. Your parents, including your cousin, all thought I was marrying up. They never accepted me, and you never stood up for me. It's been 6 years since the divorce, and we both have new families now. You suddenly came all this way to find me, is that fair?" I stopped mid-sentence and smirked. "Flora, let's put an end to this marriage once and for all." The last glimmer of light in Flora's eyes completely extinguished. End of fate, let's part on good terms. I returned her words exactly as she had said them. In the distance, my senior beckoned to me with our daughter in her arms, bathed in the morning light. I raised my lips and walked past Flora, taking big strides towards them. Our daughter stood between us, and my ex-wife and I locked eyes for a moment, both smiling simultaneously. We held our daughter's little hands, one on each side, and slowly walked towards the depths of the flower field. The sunlight was still radiant, and every day remained beautiful. The misfortune of a marriage is not the end, but the beginning of a journey towards happiness. As human beings, we will always encounter various hardships and obstacles, but as long as we hold on to our initial intentions, there will always be someone willing to break through layers of mist and come running towards us.
Extra, Flora. Chapter 1. The glaring sunlight shone through the window, piercing my eyes. I groggily opened my eyes, the sudden cold I caught making my head throb. The phone on the bedside table continued to ring incessantly, displaying the words "Michael" on the screen. Annoyance welled up inside me, and I threw the phone against the wall. Shattered into pieces. The world returned to tranquility. I pinched my brow. Despite the pounding headache, Ivan's words from yesterday kept echoing in my ears, each word distancing himself from me. They were the very words I had once said, but only when he returned them to me did I realize the true intent behind each and every one. It has been 6 years since the divorce, and we both have our own families. We shouldn't be disturbing each other. But I can't control it. I remember all the kindness he had shown me, back when he treated me so well that I could hardly bear to be apart from him. The turmoil in our relationship started when he went on his first business trip, and at that critical moment, I met Michael, a glimmer of moonlight from my youth. It's hard to imagine that, years after graduation, the moonlight that belonged to my youthful days would fall upon me so unexpectedly. It was hard to resist, even though I knew it was wrong to betray Ivan. In the end, it was I who betrayed the marriage. My mother was right, back then I had my fill of good days. After the divorce, I had once entertained the thought of going to find him, but I never took action. No one knows better than me how much Ivan loved me, truly, deeply loved me. When you're loved, you become fearless. So what if I made the first mistake? I was still fearless. It wasn't until 6 years later, when I saw Ivan again and saw Mary standing by his side. No one knows the unspeakable thoughts that crossed my mind, and no one will ever know that it was because I found out about Mary's feelings for Ivan that I coincidentally appeared by Ivan's side first. Mary has good judgment when it comes to people. Ivan is a great partner. But I can't understand. How could someone as proud as Mary marry a divorced man? Chapter 2. Mary is not only beautiful, but also smart, kind, and polite. She is only 1 year older than me, but she is considered the ideal child by most parents in the neighborhood, including mine. At first, my impression of Mary was just that of a friendly neighbor. I didn't have the same strong liking for her as my other friends did, but I didn't dislike her either. It wasn't until one day when my father looked at me, covered in dirt after a day of playing, shaking his head and sighing. I still remember his words clearly, "If only you could be as sensible as Mary." It was the first time I heard my serious and strict father praise someone, and that someone wasn't me. Without realizing it, feelings of jealousy started to grow within me. And as my mother praised Mary's excellent grades to Mary's mother, and my cousin said to Mary, "Mary, you're so good, even better than my own cousin," the jealousy continued to spread. I began to secretly observe Mary's every move, and I discovered that her life was quite simple. Besides studying, she spent her time taking care of her plants and cats. She liked to sit under a tree in the garden and read, with her upper body hidden in the shade, her slender legs bathed in sunlight, and her chubby orange cat lazily sleeping in her arms. Sunlight, flowers, a young girl, a chubby orange cat, and the shade of a tree. It looked so beautiful no matter how you looked at it. That quiet and well-behaved girl, no wonder she was favored by the elders. I restrained my mischievous nature and started consciously and unconsciously learning from Mary, learning her temperament, and even learning how she dressed. Even I knew that I was just a counterfeit. While I despised this version of myself, I couldn't resist continuing to imitate her. Because even my parents started praising the changes in me. Until I was 16, the year when Mary turned 17. On the way back home from school, Mary was cornered in an alley by someone. Mary was truly outstanding, to the point where it attracted resentment. It was a complete and humiliating form of bullying. It was the first time Mary had encountered such a situation, and she was so panicked that her voice changed when she cried for help. It was already after evening self-study, and there were many classmates passing by the entrance of the alley, but no one was willing to stop. I stopped in my tracks, but I didn't dare to go and help. Until a tall and thin boy heard the sound and stopped at the entrance of the alley. He peered inside, and once he saw the situation, without a word, he grabbed a wooden stick from the wall and rushed in. One person can't fight against four, so naturally, the boy didn't come out unscathed. He was beaten badly, but he successfully rescued Mary. I heard him, in pain and distorted, but still threatening, "If I see you bullying her again, I'll kill you." The boy and Mary supported each other as they walked out of the alley, while I hid behind a tree. In that moment, because I had stood by and watched, I suddenly felt that I would never be able to face Mary again. Chapter 3. Later, in Mary's art studio, I saw a portrait of that young boy. It depicted his back, with the boy's name Ivan written at the edge of the painting. Perhaps I understood Mary better than she understood herself, because just by looking at that painting, I could guess Mary's thoughts. Teenage girls always have a hero fantasy. The boy who stood up that night was undoubtedly a hero in Mary's eyes. But Mary didn't intentionally get close to Ivan. She would just occasionally hand him a bottle of mineral water after he finished playing basketball, all sweaty. Ivan would take the water from Mary's hand, thanking her with a smile. The 16 or 17-year-old boy had a handsome face, clear eyes that seemed to see through everything. But in his eyes, when he looked at Mary, there was only unfamiliarity. He didn't know Mary, didn't recognize the young girl he had saved that night. Of course, Mary was always proud. Naturally, she didn't want the person she liked to see her in a sorry state. After Ivan left, Mary stared at his figure for a while. Her eyes blinked rapidly twice, and a slight smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. I knew that was how she expressed her liking for someone. After so many years, it was the first time I saw Mary interested in the opposite sex. If I were to snatch away the person Mary liked. Despicable emotions surged uncontrollably from within me, unstoppable. Being with Ivan turned out to be smoother than I had imagined. During that time, I saw the disappointment in Mary's eyes more than once. But Mary was Mary. Her pride prevented her from snatching someone away from others. This only strengthened my determination to be with Ivan. Finally, in the year when Mary turned 18, her father's illegitimate child, who had been living elsewhere, came to find her. Mary's mother had a fiery temperament, and she couldn't bear this humiliation, but her good upbringing prevented her from engaging in a public confrontation. Mary's mother took Mary and left home, and I finally didn't have to live under her shadow anymore. For some reason, I didn't break up with Ivan. He was a good person, with a great personality, much more interesting than I had imagined. After living for 17 or 18 years, he was the first boy I had ever gotten close to. I couldn't distinguish whether my feelings for him were genuine or just a result of the bet we made back then. Almost naturally, after graduation, we obtained our marriage certificate. Chapter 4. At the beginning, I truly held the thought of spending my lifetime with Ivan. Why I changed later, I don't want to think about it anymore. Perhaps, as Ivan said, it was the divorce. I didn't want to see him with another woman, especially not Mary, the person I had intentionally avoided. On the day before I was about to leave, Michael and my cousin suddenly came together to find me. They didn't find me, instead, they naturally found Ivan. My cousin was used to being arrogant in front of Ivan. When I arrived, she was insulting Ivan, mocking him for not being respectable and shamelessly intruding into someone else's family after the divorce. Ivan's expression didn't change in the slightest. He glanced briefly at my cousin and Michael, mocking them, saying, "The leash at home can't hold you anymore, so you've come to someone else's doorstep to bark?" My cousin's face turned extremely ugly. Before she could speak, Ivan suddenly laughed. He looked at Michael and said, "So, you're the man who was the third party back then. Have you adapted to your new role after being promoted from a third party to a legitimate relationship all these years?" Michael's face turned extremely grim. Only then did Ivan seem to notice me standing behind them. He sighed, as if he found their argument meaningless. He said to Michael, "In this world, karma always comes around, never fails. Michael, whether you believe it or not, the pain I went through back then, you will undoubtedly experience tenfold in the future." Michael turned his back to me, and I couldn't see his expression, only the raised veins on the back of his hand. He owed Ivan first, and no matter what Ivan said, he couldn't argue back. In the end, Ivan waved them off, saying, "Flora, take them away from here." I never want to see you again in my life." With that, he held Mary's hand and disappeared into the colorful sea of flowers. I watched their gradually receding figures, feeling a painful bitterness in my heart. Michael approached me with a stern face, probably wanting to take out his frustrations from Ivan on me, saying, "What? Not enjoying it here anymore?" I glanced at him, remembering his deliberate presence during my marriage to Ivan. My despicable intention to snatch someone away, it must have been him confessing everything to Mary. The feeling of disgust lingered in my heart, and I turned away. For the sake of that prideful bet, I lost the young man who had walked with me through my entire youth. In the end, I was defeated by Mary. From now on, I will forever lose the person who loved me the most.